What if the most dangerous weapon in this war right now is not a missile at all? What if it is a bridge? Somewhere in southern Iran tonight, a road that carried food, fuel, and soldiers a week ago simply does not exist anymore. And that single fact might tell you more about how this war ends than any missile strike could. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of how the United States just shifted its targeting strategy to Iran's bridges and power plants, hit that like button right now, because understanding this means understanding why infrastructure has become the new battlefield. Subscribe if you want to follow this conflict as it actually unfolds with the kind of grounded analysis you will not find anywhere else, and send this to someone who still thinks this war is only about missiles and warships, because the real story is being written on roads and power lines. Let us start with what actually happened, because the headlines alone do not tell the real story. Over the last several days, American forces have carried out a new wave of strikes across southern Iran. These were not strikes on missile batteries or radar stations. These strikes hit bridges, energy infrastructure, and a port facility, according to Iranian state media. And Iran responded by striking a power and desalination plant in Kuwait. Think about that exchange for a second. One side hits roads and power lines inside Iran. The other side hits a water plant in a neighboring country. That is not a battle over a single battlefield anymore. That is two governments reaching for the machinery that keeps ordinary life running and using it as a bargaining chip against each other. This did not come out of nowhere. For weeks, the fighting had circled around one narrow strip of water, the Strait of Hormuz. It is one of the busiest oil corridors on the planet, and when Iran moves to restrict traffic through it, the whole world feels it in fuel prices within days. The United States responded with a stretch of strikes on bridges and other infrastructure in southern Iran, part of a campaign now running for roughly a week, all aimed at pressuring Tehran to give up its grips on the Strait. And this was not a quiet operation carried out in the shadows. American Central Command publicly confirmed a new wave of strikes, describing them as targeting surveillance sites, military logistics infrastructure, underground weapon storage, and maritime capability using fighter jets, drones, and warships together. This is the military openly telling the world what it is doing and why, which is itself a kind of message aimed at more than just Iran's generals. Here's where the story gets more personal and honestly more disturbing. Over 2 days, strikes damaged at least 6 bridges and a tunnel near Bandar Abbas, a critical hub on Iran's southern coast, based on footage shown on Iranian state television. The apparent purpose was not random destruction. It looked designed to cut off Revolutionary Guard bases in that area from the rest of the country. That is a very specific kind of target. You are not trying to flatten a city. You are trying to isolate a military network by taking away the roads it depends on to move people, fuel, and supplies. But the campaign did not stop at military logistics. Strikes also hit an agricultural water pumping station in Khuzestan, and one person died there, according to local officials. And in a moment that should stop you cold, a reported strike on July 18th hit a water desalination plant in Jask, right outside the Strait of Hormuz, destroying its pumping stations and cutting water access for around 10,000 people living nearby. 10,000 people. Not soldiers, not commanders, just people who turned on a tap one morning and nothing came out. Iran has not been sitting still through any of this either. That strike on the Jask desalination plant came right after Iran had struck U.S. bases in Jordan, where at least 3 American soldiers were killed and others were wounded. And this cycle keeps repeating. One side hits, the other side hits back, and each round seems to reach a little further into civilian life than the last one. There is a moment in all of this that is almost impossible to believe unless you see it written down plainly. A U.S. strike on a border crossing with Iraq killed 2 people, and that crossing had hundreds of pilgrims gathered at the time. According to state media, people traveling for a religious pilgrimage caught in the middle of a war over a shipping lane. That is the kind of detail that gets lost in a headline about infrastructure strikes, but it is the actual human weight sitting underneath every one of those words. Now let us slow down for a moment and really think about the scale of what is being described here. This is not one bridge in one city on one day. This is a pattern that stretches across an entire southern coastline, hitting ports, tunnels, pumping stations, and rail lines almost simultaneously. When strikes hit that many different types of infrastructure in such a short window, it tells you the target list was not drawn up overnight. Someone spent a long time studying exactly how Iran moves fuel, water, and soldiers around its own territory, then picked out the specific points where cutting one line would cause the widest possible disruption. That kind of planning takes intelligence gathering that most people never think about when they picture a bombing campaign. It is not just about finding a bridge on a map. It is about knowing which bridge out of hundreds is the one a military base actually depends on to function. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, drop a like right now and share this video with anyone trying to understand the real stakes of this conflict. This is the kind of context that completely changes how you see the news. So why bridges? Why power plants? Why not just keep hitting military hardware the way this war started? The answer traces back to one specific warning. The American military has been striking both military targets and civilian ports and bridges in Iran. This has killed dozens of people. And behind that shift is a direct threat from the very top of the US government. The warning is simple and blunt. Anytime Iranian forces fire on a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether by missile, rocket, drone, or any other weapon, the United States will destroy one bridge or power plant in response. And that includes targets near or inside Tehran itself. Read that again. It is not a general policy. It is a formula. One attack on a ship equals one destroyed piece of Iranian infrastructure. That is about as direct as war can get. And it is designed that way on purpose because it turns an abstract military campaign into something the Iranian government can calculate in advance, and something ordinary Iranians can feel almost immediately long before any official announcement ever reaches them. This kind of threat did not just appear out of thin air in July either. It has actually been building for months. Go back to early April and you will find the same warning, almost word for word. Strikes back, then hit 2 bridges and a train station, and Iranian officials were urging young people to physically form human chains around power stations to protect them. Think about that image for a moment. Ordinary civilians, not soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder around a power plant, hoping their bodies might somehow stop a guided missile. That is not strategy. That is desperation dressed up as defiance. Let us go back to that April moment for a second, because it explains a lot about where we are right now. Airstrikes across Iran killed at least 15 people in a single day back then, while Iran fired missiles at Israel and Saudi Arabia. And one strike temporarily forced the closure of a major bridge. And in that same window, strikes damaged or destroyed one of Iran's tallest bridges, along with a century-old medical research center that had been fighting diseases like cholera. A hospital-adjacent research facility built to protect people from disease. Damaged in a war over a strait most of those researchers had nothing to do with. The American president's language during that period was not diplomatic at all. He publicly threatened to hit bridges next, then electric power plants, and said Iran's leadership knew what needed to be done and had to do it fast. And just a few days later, the threat escalated even further. He posted that Tuesday would become what he called Power Plant Day. And Bridge Day rolled into one, warning Iran to open the strait or face consequences he described as nothing like anything before. Whatever you think about that kind of language, you cannot deny what it does. It turns a military campaign into a countdown clock that the entire country can see ticking down in real time. And Iran's president responded to that pressure in a way that tells you how deep this crisis had already gone. He said that 14 million people, including himself, had volunteered to fight. Whether that number is exact or symbolic almost does not matter. It is a government trying to show the world and its own people that it will not simply hand over the strait because of a threat against its bridges and its power grid. It is a message of resolve built on top of a population that had just been told to physically protect its own power stations with nothing but numbers and presence. Now, here is a detail that changes how you should think about this entire campaign. This is not only a story about the United States pressuring Iran. Kuwait got pulled directly into it too. Kuwait reported that an attack had knocked one of its water desalination plants offline. A country that was not even the primary target of this war suddenly had its own civilians facing water shortages because of strikes connected to the same widening conflict. That is how infrastructure warfare spreads. It does not respect a border the way a ground battle does. Knock out one power grid or one water system, and the ripple moves outward to whoever depends on it, even people living in a completely different country who never asked to be part of any of this. And remember, this specific round of strikes did not happen in isolation. This latest threat came directly after American forces completed a rescue operation for a pilot whose aircraft had gone down behind Iranian lines. Iran's military claimed at the time that it had shot down multiple American aircraft near southern Isfahan during that rescue attempt, saying 2 helicopters and a transport plane had been destroyed by its forces. So this is not a clean, one-directional campaign where one side simply punishes the other from a distance. It is a real exchange with real losses on both sides. And infrastructure has become one of the main battlegrounds. At this point, if you are enjoying this deep dive and want to stay updated on how this story develops, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and join our community of viewers who understand that the real story is always what happens beneath the surface. Let us actually break down why a bridge or power plant became such a powerful target in the first place. Because on the surface, it might not seem as dramatic as blowing up a missile site. A missile site is a threat that could fire again tomorrow. A bridge is different. A bridge is the thing that lets soldiers move, lets fuel trucks move, lets food reach a city that depends on it. Destroy a missile launcher, and a country can often replace it in weeks if the parts and factories exist somewhere inside its own borders. Destroy a bridge, especially a major one connecting a military hub to the rest of the country, and you are looking at months, sometimes years, of rebuilding, especially when a country is already isolated from international financing and foreign contractors because of years of accumulated sanctions. Power plants work the same way, except the impact is even more immediate and even more personal. A power plant does not just run tanks and radar systems. It runs hospitals. It runs water treatment. It runs the refrigeration that keeps food from spoiling in every neighborhood market. When a government starts explicitly threatening power infrastructure, it is no longer talking to the military leadership alone. It is speaking directly to every family sitting in their living room, wondering if the lights will still work tomorrow night, and whether the fridge keeping their food safe will still be running in the morning. And that is exactly why Iran's own government reacted the way it did, urging civilians to form human chains around these plants. That is not really a military defense. Human bodies cannot stop a precision-guided weapon. What it actually does is send a message back in the opposite direction, telling the world and telling its own people that Iran is willing to put its own citizens in harm's way rather than give up control of the Strait. It is a symbol wrapped around a decision that has enormous stakes, and it puts ordinary young volunteers directly between a war they did not start and the machinery their whole country runs on. Let us talk about something that rarely gets enough attention when people cover a war like this: the money underneath all of it. Iran has spent years living under heavy international sanctions. Under normal circumstances, a country facing this level of infrastructure damage would lean on foreign loans, international contractors, and imported materials to rebuild quickly. Sanctions cut off most of those paths. That means every bridge that goes down, every power plant that gets damaged, has to be repaired using resources the country already has, at a moment when those same resources are being pulled in a dozen different directions by the war itself. Every unit of currency spent rebuilding a bridge is currency not spent on the military. And every unit spent on the military is currency not spent rebuilding the bridge. That tension does not show up in a single headline, but it quietly shapes how long a country can actually keep fighting before something has to give. This is actually one of the oldest ideas in warfare, dressed up in a much more precise form than history has ever seen before. Militaries have targeted bridges, railways, and power grids in conflicts stretching back generations, because leaders have always understood that an army needs roads as much as it needs weapons, and a population needs electricity as much as it needs food. What is different now is the precision. Older infrastructure, campaigns from past wars tended to be blunt instruments, wide strikes on entire power grids and transportation networks that caused enormous civilian disruption without necessarily changing anything in the mind of the government being targeted. A guided strike on one specific bridge span or one specific transformer yard is a much sharper tool. It aims to hit exactly the piece of infrastructure that matters most to a regime's military and industrial capacity, while trying to leave enough of the wider civilian network working to avoid the kind of humanitarian catastrophe. That tends to backfire internationally and can actually harden public support behind the very government under attack. That balance is incredibly hard to strike, and it is also incredibly hard to judge from the outside while it is happening. What looks like a narrow military strike on the news can still mean 10,000 people losing access to clean water for days, the way it did in Jask. What looks like an isolated bridge strike can still mean an entire base cut off from resupply for weeks, the way it did near Bandar Abbas. The line between precise military pressure and civilian hardship is thinner than most coverage of this war ever admits. Now, think about what this specific stretch of strikes tells us about where the war might be heading next. The campaign moved from missile sites to ports, to bridges near a major military hub, to water infrastructure, and finally to explicit threats against the electricity grid itself. Each step reaches a little deeper into the everyday lives of Iranian civilians. And each step also raises the stakes for the country retaliating in return, which is exactly what happened when the strike on a Kuwaiti desalination plant pulled a third country directly into the fallout of a conflict it was not even officially part of. That is the part that should worry anyone watching this conflict closely. Wars that stay contained to military targets tend to stay somewhat predictable. Wars that expand into infrastructure and civilian systems tend to spread sideways, pulling in neighboring countries, disrupting trade routes far beyond the original battlefield, and making it much harder for either side to simply step back and de-escalate once the pressure starts building on multiple fronts at once. Once a water plant goes offline in a country that was not even part of the original fight, you're no longer looking at a two-sided conflict. You're looking at a regional crisis that keeps finding new ways to grow almost on its own momentum. There's also something worth understanding about how the messaging works on both sides of this. On the American side, the language has been blunt. and public, direct social media threats, specific deadlines, and a clear formula tying Iranian actions in the Strait to American strikes on infrastructure. That kind of clarity is itself a tool. It removes any confusion about what happens next, and it puts the pressure of the next move squarely on Tehran's decision-making. Nobody in Iran's government can claim they did not know what would follow another attack on a ship in the Strait, because it has been stated publicly repeatedly in the plainest possible language. On the Iranian side, the response has leaned on defiance and mobilization, framing the country as standing firm against an aggressor, rallying volunteers and organizing civilians to physically protect infrastructure. Both approaches are trying to shape the same audiences at once, the world watching from outside and their own people watching from inside. One government is trying to prove that continued resistance carries a cost too painful to ignore. The other is trying to prove that no cost, however painful, will be enough to force it to give up the leverage it holds over the Strait. As we approach the end of this analysis, if you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer who wants to understand the world beyond the headlines. Drop a like, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. Your engagement keeps this channel going and helps us bring you the context that mainstream media often misses. Let us think for a moment about what is actually happening inside Iran's government as all of this unfolds. Because a campaign like this does not just create external pressure, it creates internal pressure too. When a war is purely about missiles and warships, the internal response from a government tends to be fairly predictable. Replace what was destroyed, harden what remains, and keep pursuing the same overall strategy. But when the war starts eating into roads, water, and electricity, the conversation inside that government gets a lot messier. Military leaders want to keep projecting strength and refuse to back down. Economic officials are watching supply routes. And trade collapse in real time and know that every week of this costs the country resources it may not get back for years. Political leadership is trying to hold public support together, while explaining again and again why the water is not running or why the power keeps going out in certain neighborhoods. That kind of friction inside a government does not get resolved by a single dramatic strike. It builds slowly week after week until it eventually forces some kind of decision, even if that decision looks sudden, from the outside when it finally happens. That is actually the whole point of this kind of pressure campaign. It is not built around the idea that one massive strike ends the war. It is built around the idea that the accumulated weight of disrupted trade, damaged infrastructure, and an explicit threat hanging over the power grid slowly changes what a government is willing to risk continuing. And there is a regional layer to all of this that deserves more attention than it usually gets. When infrastructure inside Iran gets disrupted, or when a country like Kuwait gets pulled into the fallout, it sends a signal to every other country in the region that is watching closely. Governments and businesses across the Gulf start quietly reassessing how exposed they want to be to a conflict that keeps finding new ways to spill past its original borders. That reassessment does not always show up in official statements. Sometimes it shows up in shipping companies rerouting cargo, insurers raising rates on vessels moving anywhere near the Strait, or neighboring governments quietly increasing their own military readiness without making a big public announcement about it. Every strike that reaches beyond Iran's own borders adds one more reason for the entire region to treat this conflict as something that could touch them directly, not just something happening somewhere else on the map. It is also worth remembering that every single one of these strikes carries a human cost that does not fully show up in a strategic breakdown like this one. Somewhere near that damaged research center that had spent a century fighting diseases like cholera, there were scientists whose work just got interrupted. Somewhere near those 6 bridges outside Bandar Abbas, there were drivers, workers, and families who used those roads every single day without ever thinking twice about them. Somewhere in Jask, there are still 10,000 people dealing with the aftermath of losing access to clean water because a pumping station got destroyed. Understanding the military logic behind these strikes does not mean ignoring what they actually cost the people living underneath them. Both of those things are true at the exact same time. And a serious look at this war has to hold on to both. So where does this actually leave us right now? The Strait remains the center of gravity for this entire conflict. As long as Iran keeps using it as leverage, and as long as the United States keeps tying infrastructure strikes directly to what happens in that waterway, this cycle is unlikely to break on its own. Every attack on a ship risks another bridge. Every threatened power plant risks another round of civilian hardship. And every strike that spills into a neighboring country risks turning a two-country standoff into something the entire region gets pulled into, whether anyone wants that or not. What happens next probably will not be decided by a single dramatic strike or a single dramatic ceasefire announcement. It is more likely to come from the slow accumulation of pressure, watching whether Iran's economy can keep absorbing this level of damage, watching whether regional countries like Kuwait keep getting drawn deeper into the fallout, and watching whether either side blinks first. On the Strait itself, that is the real story behind every headline about a bridge or a power plant. It is not really about that one piece of infrastructure. It is about how much pressure a government can take before something inside it finally has to change. Before we wrap up, I want you to really sit with one image from everything we just covered. Young volunteers standing in a human chain around a power plant trying to protect it with nothing but their presence. That single image captures the entire emotional core of this conflict better than any strategic explanation could. On one side, a superpower using precision weapons and public threats to apply pressure with surgical intent. On the other side, ordinary people trying to defend their basic infrastructure with the only thing they actually have, their willingness to stand there and not move. That contrast is what makes this phase of the war so different from what came before it. It is no longer only a story about missiles and warships fighting somewhere out at sea. It is a story about roads, water, and electricity, the invisible systems that every single one of us depends on without ever thinking about them until suddenly they are gone. And when a bridge disappears or a power plant goes dark, it does not just change a military map. It changes whether a child can get to school, whether a hospital can run its equipment, whether a family can turn on a tap and actually get water. So here is what I want you to walk away with. This conflict has moved through missile exchanges, naval standoffs, and now a deliberate campaign against the physical backbone that keeps Iran functioning day to day. That shift matters because pressure on infrastructure does not fade the way a single headline does. A destroyed bridge stays destroyed. A damaged power plant stays damaged. And the slow grind of trying to rebuild under sanctions while still funding a war is exactly the kind of pressure that eventually forces hard decisions, even when no single moment looks decisive from the outside while it is happening. Watch what happens over the coming weeks, not just the next dramatic strike. Watch whether Iran manages to rebuild these bridges quickly, or whether the damage lingers longer than anyone expects. Watch whether more countries around the region get pulled into the fallout the way Kuwait just was. And watch whether the rhetoric coming out of Tehran shifts even slightly in tone, because that is usually the first sign that pressure like this is actually starting to work beneath the surface. I want to know what you think. Does hitting bridges and power plants actually change how a government makes decisions? Or does a country like Iran simply absorb this kind of pressure the same way it has through every other phase of this war? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely read them and they shape exactly what I cover next. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening beneath the headlines, hit like, subscribe if you have not already, and share it with someone still trying to make sense of this conflict. I will see you in the next one.